Hey, folks, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into the economic dumpster fire that is the US government's latest obsession with bringing iPhone manufacturing home. Spoiler alert, it's a masterclass in delusion, sprinkled with tariffs, empty promises, and a complete misunderstanding of global supply chains. I'm your host, the guy who's here to tell you why the economy's tanking, and why the government's to blame. Let's get into it. This week, the White House doubled down on its economic fantasy. President Trump wants Apple to start churning out iPhones on American soil. Why? Because apparently, nothing screams economic victory like slapping a 145% tariff on Chinese imports and forcing one of the world's most complex supply chains to uproot itself overnight. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt even had the audacity to say, if Apple didn't think the United States could do it, they probably wouldn't have put up that big chunk of change. Oh, really, Caroline? That big chunk of change, Apple's $500 billion domestic investment over 4 years, has nothing to do with manufacturing iPhones. It's for R&D, retail, and data centers, not building iPhone City in the middle of nowhere, USA. But here's the kicker, folks, this isn't just a pipe dream, it's a policy disaster waiting to happen. And if you think this is about bringing jobs back, think again. This is about political theater, economic ignorance, and a government that's willing to tank the economy just to score a few populist points. Let's break this down, layer by layer, from the surface-level PR stunt to the deep, structural economic problems it exposes. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see why the government's mismanagement is the real reason we're staring down the barrel of a recession. Let's start with the obvious, tariffs. The White House thinks slapping a 145% tariff on Chinese imports will magically force Apple to build iPhones in the US. But here's the reality, folks, tariffs don't create jobs, they destroy them. According to a 2023 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBR, Trump's previous tariff wars, 2018 to 2019, cost the U.S. economy $195 billion in lost output and eliminated 142,000 jobs. And that was with tariffs averaging just 20%. Now imagine the carnage of a 145% tariff. Higher costs for Apple mean higher iPhone prices for you, potentially up to $2,000 per device, per Bloomberg estimates. That's not winning, that's economic suicide. And let's not forget the ripple effects. The U.S. imported $540 billion worth of goods from China in 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. A tariff of this magnitude would disrupt not just Apple but thousands of companies, driving up inflation, killing consumer spending, and pushing us closer to stagflation, a toxic mix of stagnant growth and soaring prices. The Federal Reserve's latest projections, March 2025, already warn of inflation climbing to 4.2% by year-end if these tariffs go through. But hey, who needs data when you've got campaign promises, right? Now, let's peel back the curtain on why this made in the USA fantasy is dead on arrival. Apple's iPhone production isn't just a factory, it's an ecosystem. We're talking about a supply chain so intricate, it makes the human brain look like a Lego set. In China, Apple relies on FATP facilities, final assembly, test, and pack-out plants, that are basically mini-cities. Take Zhengzhou's iPhone City, for example. This Foxconn-run complex employs 350,000 people, has dormitories, schools, gyms, and medical facilities, and churns out 500,000 iPhones per day. Let me repeat that, 500,000 iPhones. Every single day. Now, tell me, folks, where in the US are we going to replicate that? Matthew Moore, a former Apple manufacturing engineer, put it best, what city in America is going to put everything down and build only iPhones? Boston is over 500,000 people. The whole city would need to stop everything and start assembling iPhones. And it's not just about bodies, it's about skills. China has millions of workers trained in precision manufacturing, thanks to decades of investment in STEM education and vocational training. In the US, not so much. According to the National Science Foundation, only 20% of US undergraduates earn STEM degrees, compared to 40% in China. And let's not even talk about tooling engineers. Tim Cook once said you could fill football fields with them in China, but in the US, you'd be lucky to fill a conference room. But wait, the government has a solution, automation. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick suggested Apple just build a fully robotic iPhone factory in the US. Sounds great, right? Except it's total nonsense. Supply chain experts agree that automation at this scale isn't feasible yet, even in China, where labor costs are lower and automation tech is cheaper. Why? Because iPhone production isn't static. Apple releases new models every year, with new materials, components, and designs. That means constantly retooling assembly lines, a process that's hard to automate. As one insider told Bloomberg, you design the thing, rebuild the factory, and then you only have 6 months to sell it. Good luck doing that with robots. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. This iPhone obsession isn't just a policy failure, it's a symptom of a government that's completely lost the plot on economic management. For decades, the US has neglected the structural investments needed to compete in global manufacturing. Instead of investing in education, infrastructure, and workforce training, we've poured trillions into tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy and endless military spending. The result? A hollowed-out industrial base, a shrinking middle class, and an economy that's dangerously dependent on consumer spending, 70% of GDP, according to the World Bank. And here's the kicker, the government's own policies are making things worse. Take the CHIPS Act of 2022, which promised $52 billion to boost US semiconductor manufacturing. Sounds good, right? Except, as of April 2025, only 10% of that funding has been dispersed, per the US Government Accountability Office. Meanwhile, China's pouring $150 billion into its semiconductor industry, outpacing us 3-1. And don't even get me started on workforce development. The US spends just 0.1% of GDP on vocational training, compared to 0.6% in Germany, a global manufacturing powerhouse, according to the OECD. Is it any wonder Apple can't find the skilled workers it needs here? But instead of addressing these structural failures, the government's solution is tariffs. Really? This is like trying to fix a broken leg with a band-aid. And the worst part is, it's not even working. Apple's already diversifying its supply chain, not to the US, but to India, Vietnam, and Thailand. India's on track to produce 35 million iPhones annually by 2026, covering a huge chunk of US demand, per Bloomberg. So much for bringing jobs back. All the White House is doing is driving up costs, alienating allies, and pushing companies to invest anywhere but here. And here's where it all comes together, folks. This tariff obsession, combined with decades of economic mismanagement, is pushing us toward a full-blown recession. The latest data from the Conference Board, March 2025, shows a 65% probability of a US recession by Q4 2025, driven by declining consumer confidence, rising inflation, and a slowing labor market. Unemployment's already ticked up to 4.8%, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and consumer debt hit a record $17.5 trillion in Q1 2025, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Meanwhile, the S&P 500's down 12% year-to-date, signaling investor panic over policy uncertainty. And who's to blame? You guessed it, the government. By prioritizing political stunts over real economic reform, they're tanking the economy and leaving ordinary Americans to pick up the pieces. Want proof? Just look at the last time we tried this tariff nonsense. During the 2018 to 2019 trade war, U.S. manufacturing output fell by 1.3%, per the Federal Reserve, and farm bankruptcies spiked 20%, per the American Farm Bureau Federation. History's repeating itself, folks, and the government's too busy chasing headlines to notice. So, what's the takeaway, folks? This, made in the USA, iPhone fantasy is a textbook example of government incompetence. It ignores the realities of global supply chains, underestimates the structural challenges in U.S. manufacturing, and risks plunging us into a recession, all for the sake of a few campaign soundbites. If the government really wanted to bring jobs back, it would invest in education, infrastructure, and innovation, not slap on tariffs and pray for a miracle. But hey, why bother with real solutions when you can just blame China, right? This is Boss Economics World, folks, where we call out the nonsense and hold the government accountable. If you're as fed up as I am, smash that like button, subscribe, and share this video. And remember, when the economy tanks, don't say we didn't warn you. Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and keep fighting the economic madness.